Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Apache Stories. Today, I want to share with you a story about a woman the world had learned to overlook, long before an Apache rancher ever dared to see her. By the winter Eliza Warren turned 38. She had learned two things: how to work herself to the bone, and how to be invisible. The town of Clear Rock lay under a hard December sky that year. Water barrels were skinned over with ice. Horses stamped steam into the air, and a thin thread of chimney smoke climbed out of every roof and vanished into the gray. The church bell rang dully through the cold, counting the days until Christmas, as if joy were something that only belonged to other people. Up the front steps of the Harrington boarding house, a slight woman in a faded blue dress labored with an armful of firewood. That was Eliza. Her cheeks were pink with cold, not from health, but from the wind that never quite let her rest. The hem of her dress was stiff with old soap and frayed at the edges where she'd worn it thin on too many scrubbed floors. She nudged the door open with her hip, breath coming in small white puffs. Inside, the warmth barely touched her. Mrs. Harrington stood in the front parlor like a queen in a kingdom of worn-out rugs and polished table legs. Her hair was piled high, her dress 2 seasons out of fashion, but carried with the sharpness of a woman who lived on other people's money. Beside her lounged her daughter, pearl cheeks powdered, fingers smooth and soft around a china teacup. Eliza had washed a dozen times before. The smell of stew drifted in from the kitchen, thin broth, tired potatoes, a scrap of meat. Eliza had stretched it as far as it would go. "It's cold in here," Pearl complained, drawing her shawl closer. "Didn't I tell you to keep more wood on the fire?" Eliza lowered the wood to the box by the hearth, careful not to let any logs thump. "Yes, ma'am. I've just brought more." Mrs. Harrington's eyes flicked over her like she was examining a stain. "And the stew?" she demanded. I could see the bottom of the pot. "Are you watering it down again? Boarders don't pay for dishwater." Eliza kept her gaze on the floor. "There wasn't much meat." "Ma'am? I thought. That's your problem, girl." Mrs. Harrington snapped. "You think." "I didn't ask you to think. I asked you to cook." Pearl tilted her head, lips curling. "And the sheets? Mama, did you see the ones on Mr. Calhoun's bed? Barely white. Honestly. Eliza, what do you do all day besides shuffle around and look tired?" It was a cruel question, but Eliza knew better than to answer it. She rose before the sun. She scrubbed floors until the boards squeaked. She washed other people's linens until her hands cracked and bled. And for all that, she was paid in leftover bones and a narrow cot in the attic where the roof leaked when it rained. No wages yet this week. Mrs. Harrington continued briskly, as if reading from a list. "You're still working off the kindness I showed you when you came begging at my door. Don't forget that." Eliza's fingers tightened around a stray piece of bark, but her voice stayed steady. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Harrington stepped closer. Her perfume, sour and sweet all at once. "And listen to me well, Eliza Warren. If you drop one more plate, if I hear one more complaint from a paying boarder, you'll be out in the snow by New Year's. Do you understand? There is no charity here for useless women." For a moment, the whole house seemed to hold its breath. Eliza swallowed hard. On the outside, she looked exactly the way they had trained her to look: small, quiet, compliant. But somewhere deep in her chest, a voice rose up, that did not belong to Mrs. Harrington. I am not useless, it whispered, and I will not die in this house. She didn't say it out loud. Not yet. She only nodded and turned toward the hallway, carrying her silence like a fragile cup she couldn't afford to spill. In the dim corridor near the kitchen, a scrap of color caught her eye. Someone had tacked a flyer crookedly on the wall. The edges were curled, the ink a little smudged, but the words were clear enough. Winter Market, 2 days before Christmas. Town Square. Eliza stood there, a long moment, dish rag in one hand, breath shallow. A market meant people, and people meant hunger. Men and women with coins in their pockets and cold in their bones, looking for something warm to put between their hands. Slowly, she reached into her apron pocket and unfolded a tiny, much-handled piece of paper, her own neat handwriting, cramped and careful bread, buttermilk biscuits, sticky cinnamon rolls like the ones her mother used to make before life turned hard. Her thumb brushed over the words, as if they were a prayer. If I can sell just enough, she whispered to herself, hardly daring the sound. Maybe I don't have to stay here. Behind her, Mrs. Harrington called for more wood, more scrubbing, more of everything that had already taken most of Eliza's life. But standing in that narrow hallway, with flower memories on her fingers and the promise of the winter market on the wall, Eliza felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not hope. Exactly. Hope was too big a word for a woman like her. No. It was smaller than that. A crack in the ice. A hairline break in the prison she'd called home. One fragile chance. And the winter wind outside the boarding house rattled the windows, as if the whole town of Clear Rock was waiting to see what she would do with it. That night, the Harrington boarding house went to sleep one light at a time. Doors clicked shut. The last boarder stomped up the stairs, grumbling about the cold. Mrs. Harrington rattled the lock on the front door and reminded Eliza that decent girls were in bed by 9. Not prowling around like shadows. Eliza murmured, "Yes, ma'am," and climbed to her attic cot. She waited. She lay still, listening as the house settled. The wind pressed against the walls with a low, steady moan. Someone coughed in the room below. Pearl giggled once at something in a book, then went quiet. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked and ticked and ticked, counting out a life that didn't belong to Eliza Warren at all. When the clock finally struck 11, she slipped from her cot. The boards creaked under her bare feet, but she knew which ones to avoid. She moved through the dark like someone who'd spent years learning how not to be noticed. In the kitchen, the coals in the stove still glowed faintly red. Eliza knelt, added a few sticks of wood, and coaxed the flames back to life. With careful breaths, the small flare of warmth painted her face in gold and shadow. On the table, she spread out what she had. A small sack of flour she'd bought, pinch by pinch, trading bits of her own supper for it. A stub of butter, a handful of precious sugar, a jar of cinnamon she'd carried with her through every house that hadn't wanted her. She'd saved them the way some women saved ribbons. Her fingers moved without needing to think, measuring by memory. Flour and salt. Warm water from the kettle. The yeast she'd coaxed to life in a chipped mug. She stirred until the spoon dragged, then turned the dough out onto the table. For the first time all day, the harsh lines in her shoulders loosened. Here, under her hands, life made sense. Dough didn't lie. It didn't gossip. It didn't decide you were worthless because your dress was faded and your hands were rough. if you gave it warmth and time and patience. It rose. It became something that could feed a hungry man, or soften a hard day, or remind a lonely child of better winters. Eliza pressed her palms into the dough and began to knead, push, fold, turn. The rhythmic thump of dough against wood filled the kitchen. The smell of yeast rose up, warm and hopeful. Flour dusted her sleeves, streaked her hair, settled on the tip of her nose, where she unconsciously brushed it with the back of her hand. She shaped plain loaves, first rough, honest things with rounded tops, the kind men could tear apart with cold fingers and dip into stew. Then, with what she had left, she worked on the sweet rolls. She rolled the dough thin, brushed on melted butter, sprinkled sugar and cinnamon in a winding trail. As she rolled it up, slice by slice, she remembered her mother's laughter in a different kitchen, in a different town, before everything had gone wrong. People forgive a lot when their mouths are full of something warm, her mother had said once, winking over a pan of cinnamon rolls. Remember that, Eliza girl. I'm trying, Eliza whispered now, to a woman who'd been gone a long time. By the time the first light of morning crept under the back door, Eliza had filled every pan she owned. The oven breathed out waves of heat as she drew out tray after tray golden loaves. Rolls swirled with dark sugar, their tops sticky and shining. Her stomach growled, but she only allowed herself the smallest piece from a torn roll. The rest, she wrapped. She folded each loaf and bundle of rolls into squares of old linen she'd bought at the dry goods store. Cloth that had once been a curtain. Her stitches were neat, her knots careful. To anyone else, it might look like nothing much, just bread, from a woman in a plain dress. To Eliza, it was all the courage she could carry. The winter market in Clear Rock was already busy by the time she reached the town square. Her breath puffed in little clouds as she set up her stall, a borrowed crate. A board laid across it, a crooked, hand-painted sign she'd done herself. Warm bread, 5 cents. Around her, color and laughter swirled. Fancy ladies from the big houses on the hill showed off cakes layered high with frosting as white as first snow. Younger girls in bright shawls sold jars of preserves with neat ribbons tied around the lids. A fiddler played near the fountain, and somewhere a man called out about hot chestnuts. Eliza's stall looked small among them, modest, forgettable. She laid out her loaves anyway. At first, a few curious folks slowed, sniffed, and moved on. A woman with a fur-trimmed cape eyed the sign, then turned to her friend with a laugh just loud enough to carry. Boarding house bread, she scoffed. I'd sooner chew a boot. Eliza pretended not to hear. Then she heard the voices she knew too well. My, look what we have here, Mrs. Harrington drawled as she swept past, Pearl tight on her arm. I told you, didn't I? Pearl, no gratitude. You give some women a roof and a crust, and they think they're bakers now. Pearl tittered, eyes glittering with malice. No one wants bread from the boarding house drudge. Mama, they want something made by ladies. Several heads turned. A few people stepped away from Eliza's stall, as if the shame might rub off on them. Heat flared in Eliza's cheeks, hotter than the ovens had been. She stared down at her hands, watching them start to shake. Maybe they're right, she thought bitterly. Maybe I should have stayed invisible. Footsteps slowed in front of her table. A shadow fell across the loaves, broader than most, blocking out the winter sun. Eliza looked up. A tall man stood there, wrapped in a worn sheepskin coat, dark hair tied back at the nape of his neck. His skin was the deep bronze of someone who lived under open sky. His cheekbones high, his eyes a quiet, steady brown that missed nothing. She'd seen him before. At a distance, the Apache rancher, whose land lay just beyond town. Folks called him that Greyhawk man, in the same tone they reserved for storms and strangers. He picked up one of her loaves, turning it in his big hands as if he could feel the story baked into it. How much, he asked. For a while, the cold didn't seem so sharp. By mid-morning, Eliza's stall no longer looked quite so small. The crate was lighter than when she'd set it down. The linen wraps had thinned into a rumpled pile. Warm breath rose from the last of the loaves, like a promise. She kept her coins tucked in a little cloth purse inside her apron pocket. Fingertips, brushing it after each sale, as if to make sure it was still there. It clinked faintly now when she moved 5-cent pieces, a couple of dimes, even a quarter someone had pressed into her hand with a smile, and a "keep the change, dear." That smell carried clear across the square. By the time the church bell tolled noon, only a few sweet rolls remained. Eliza sold the second to last to a tired-looking mother with 2 children clinging to her skirts. She slipped the last one into a paper twist and, after glancing around, placed it in the hand of the fiddler by the fountain. "Payment for the music," she said, eyes dropping. He grinned, eyebrows lifting. "Best day's wages I've had all season." When it was done, when the table stood empty, and the sign for warm bread, 5 cents, hung crooked and alone, Eliza finally let herself breathe. She stepped to the edge of the square and turned away from the wind, fingers trembling as she loosened the ties on her coin purse. Right there, under the pale winter sun, she counted 1, 2, 3 dimes, several nickels, a scattering of pennies. The quarter gleamed up at her like a little moon. "Eliza Warren," she whispered to herself. "You did it." Her mind jumped ahead the way it hadn't dared in years. A train ticket west, maybe, or a room of her own in town, just for a month, where no one could barge in or call her girl like she was still a child. A chance to stand up in a place where nobody knew who she'd been, only who she was willing to be. She closed her fist around the coins. The metal, cold and solid, against her palm. Across the square, where the cattle buyers and ranchers tended to gather, a tall figure leaned against the rail near the hitching posts. Jonas Greyhawk's hat brim shaded his eyes. But he saw more than most men nevertheless. He'd watched the way the crowd had shifted after he spoke at her stall, watched people who'd nearly walked by decide to turn back, drawn by the smell of bread and the weight of his few simple words. He'd seen the way Eliza's shoulders had straightened with each sale, the light that had slowly kindled in her tired eyes. Jonas did not move toward her. He had learned, over long years, that some things were broken when a man rushed in. So he watched instead, silent, as she tucked her coins away and wrapped her shawl a little tighter around her narrow shoulders. Snow began to fall as she walked back toward the boarding house, gentle flakes that melted on her cheeks and eyelashes. She hardly felt the cold at all. By the time she reached the front steps of the Harrington place, her hope was burning bright enough to warm her from the inside out. Mrs. Harrington was waiting. She stood just inside the front door, arms folded over her ample chest, lips pressed into a line, so thin it nearly disappeared. Pearl hovered at her elbow, curiosity, and something uglier, flickering in her eyes. "You're late, Mrs. Harrington said sharply. "Market's been over for hours." Did you forget you have duties here? Eliza unpinned her shawl. Snowflakes, dripping onto the mat. I'm sorry, ma'am. I sold almost everything. I thought if I could. How much? The older woman cut in. Eliza blinked. Ma'am, how much did you make? Show me. The fragile warmth in Eliza's chest faltered. It's for a room, she said quietly. I was hoping, maybe after New Year's, I could. Mrs. Harrington stepped forward, hands snapping out faster than Eliza could flinch. She grabbed Eliza's wrist, yanking her hand away from the safety of her apron. Don't you dare tell me what you were hoping, she hissed. I took you in when no one else would. I fed you. I clothed you. You baked in my kitchen. With my flour. In my pans. That money is house money. Rent. Expenses. Do you understand? Eliza tried to pull back. But the flour I bought myself. The slap wasn't across her cheek this time. Mrs. Harrington struck downward. Open palm smacking into the small, knotted purse trapped in Eliza's fingers. Coins flew like startled birds, pinging off the floorboards, rolling into corners and under baseboards. Pearl laughed a bright, cruel sound. Oh, look at that. Cinderella lost her pennies. Eliza dropped to her knees, scrambling after the coins. Fingertips chasing the glint of metal. Her throat burned. She told herself it was from bending too fast. From the cold outside that still hadn't left her blood behind her. Skirts rustled. Mrs. Harrington's shoes appeared in her narrow field of vision, one by one. Those coins Eliza had counted so carefully disappeared into the older woman's gloved hand. What you earn under my roof, Mrs. Harrington said, voice smooth with false righteousness, belongs to this house. You'd do well to remember that. Girl, Eliza froze. A lone nickel pressed against her palm. She closed her fingers around it. So small a thing in the face of everything she'd just lost. Please, she whispered. Not sure which of them she was begging. Just a part of it. Enough for you to run off and leave me without help. Mrs. Harrington scoffed. After all, my Christian charity, you ungrateful little stray. You ought to be thanking me. Not bargaining like some saloon girl, Pearl snorted. She couldn't even manage that. The last of the coins disappeared into the pocket of Mrs. Harrington's dress. Now then, the landlady said briskly, as if the matter were settled and tidy. You've taken enough of my time. There are floors to scrub, supper to cook, and you'd better pray you don't break a single dish. Eliza rose slowly, that one nickel still hidden in her clenched fist. She didn't speak. There didn't seem to be any words that could cross the distance between who they believed her to be and who she was trying, somehow, to become. By evening, the snow that had begun as a gentle drift had turned into a storm. Wind howled down Clear Rock's narrow streets, driving white curtains across the lamplight. Windows rattled. Horses huddled close in their stalls. Somewhere, a child started to cry, and was hushed with promises of Christmas morning. In the Harrington boarding house, the parlor fire crackled high for the paying guests. Stew simmered on the stove. Laughter rose and fell around the supper table, and on the front porch, Mrs. Harrington wrestled a battered trunk across the floorboards. She heaved it down the steps, the old leather scraping and bumping, then straightened and smoothed her dress. The door behind her stood wide open, spilling warmth onto the snow. Eliza stood just inside the threshold, her thin coat buttoned up to her throat. A small bundle of clothes and the last of her recipes clutched in her arms. "You can't mean this," she said weakly. "It's 2 days before Christmas. I've worked." Mrs. Harrington's voice rose, sharp as the wind. "Listen well. You foolish woman. No man wanted you. No family wants you. And I don't either." She flung her hand toward the street, toward the darkness beyond the lamplight. "Take your bread and go freeze for all I care." Her words, loud and ugly, flew out into the storm. A neighbor across the way shifted a curtain, then let it fall. No one stepped out. No one protested. The door slammed, just like that. The warmth vanished. Eliza stood on the porch, the cold wrapping itself around her like a second, crueler skin. Snowflakes caught in her hair, melted on her lashes. Her breath came fast and shallow, clouding the air in front of her face. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then she stepped down, one hand gripping the handle of the trunk, the other pressed to her small bundle. The trunk was heavy, its weight dragging at her arm as she pulled it along the rutted street. Snow swirled, erasing her footprints almost as soon as she made them. The town of Clear Rock, which had seemed so full and bright at the market that morning, had drawn in on itself. Light glowed behind curtains and closed doors. Chimneys smoked. Somewhere, someone played a hymn on a piano. Eliza's teeth chattered. Is this how a life ends, she wondered, as the wind shoved at her back? Not with someone calling your name, or running after you, but with a suitcase handle cutting into your fingers and no one missing you when you fall. Her vision blurred. It was getting hard to tell where the sky ended and the ground began. Snow stung her cheeks like tiny slaps. She kept walking, because there was nothing else to do. Snow has a way of swallowing sound. By the time Eliza reached the edge of the market square, the storm had thickened into a white curtain. Stalls stood empty now, just dark shapes under sagging canvas. The fountain was a ghost, its basin filled with ice. The cheerful fiddler was long gone. Only the wind remained, pushing her sideways, tugging at her coat, trying to fold her in on herself. Her legs trembled with every step. The trunk had become a living thing, determined to drag her down. Once, her foot caught on a chunk of frozen mud, and she stumbled, catching herself with both hands in the snow. Cold bit through the thin fabric of her sleeves, like teeth. She tried to stand again. This time, her body didn't quite answer. The trunk slid from her grasp. She sank to her knees, breath punching out of her lungs in a raw gasp. The coins she'd dreamt of were gone. The attic cot was gone. The faint, flitting picture of a ticket and a room of her own scattered like the snowflakes swirling around her. For a long moment, Eliza simply knelt there in the middle of the empty square, shoulders shaking, hair coming loose from its knot. The world narrowed to the pounding of her heart in her ears and the cruel, steady whisper of the wind. So this is it, she thought dully. Not even dramatic, just cold. Her body tipped sideways almost gently, as if someone had laid a hand on her shoulder and eased her down. The cobblestones were hard under her hip, the snow suddenly soft under her cheek. Her eyes fluttered, then shut. The lamps along the street blurred and streaked, and finally went dark. Bootsteps cut through the hush a few minutes later. Jonas Greyhawk had stayed later than most in town, checking on supplies for the ranch, waiting out what he'd hoped would be a short squall. It hadn't been. Snow dotted his hat brim and clung to the shoulders of his sheepskin coat as he guided the wagon toward the livery. He almost missed her. At first, she was just another drifted shape on the edge of the square. half buried, where snow had piled against a fallen trunk. But something about the angle of that small, still body tugged at a place in him that remembered too many winters. Too many people lost when no one had gone looking in time. Jonas, the woman beside him, said quietly, peering through the swirling white. Do you see? I see, he answered. He hauled on the reins, the wagon wheels grinding to a stop. The horses snorted. Stamping, he stepped down into the snow. Up close, there was no mistaking her, even with her hair unpinned and her face gone pale under a dusting of frost. She was the same woman from the market, the one with the shy eyes and the bread that tasted like something he'd almost forgotten. Eliza, he said, testing the name on the air, hoping it might call her back. She didn't stir. He knelt and laid his gloved hand against her cheek. Her skin was cold, but not yet the terrible still cold he'd known out on the high country. She's breathing, he murmured over his shoulder. His younger sister, Mara, came up beside him, skirts tucked into sturdy boots, dark braid slipping over her shoulder. She was in her early 30s, with the same straight nose and steady eyes as her brother, but where Jonas was carved in quiet lines. Mara carried warmth like a lamp. That's the baker from the market, she said softly. The one with the cinnamon rolls. Jonas slid his coat from his shoulders and wrapped it around Eliza, tucking the edges in tight, as if he could will his own heat into her. He lifted her carefully, surprised by how light. She was too light for a woman who spent her days lifting pots and hauling water. He glanced back at Mara, voice low and firm. She's the baker from the market. We're not leaving her here. Mara nodded once, already moving to open the back of the wagon. I didn't plan on it. The last thing Eliza remembered was the cold finding its way inside her bones. The next thing she knew, warmth was pressing in from all sides. She floated for a while, in that strange, heavy comfort. Somewhere between sleep and waking, she became aware, slowly, of things: the soft rasp of a fire nearby, the hiss and pop of a log breaking apart, the distant murmur of voices. The air smelled like coffee and wood smoke, and something sweet, something baking. Her fingers twitched against thick quilts. The fabric under her cheek wasn't rough boarding house linen, but something softer, patched but clean. She opened her eyes. Light filtered in through a small window, pale and winter weak, edged by frost. The walls around her were made of logs, the seams filled with chinked clay. A braided rug lay on the floor beside the bed. On a peg by the door hung a worn but well-mended dress that was not hers. For a moment, panic flared. Too many unfamiliar details all at once. Then the door eased open, and a woman stepped inside carrying a steaming mug. You're awake, she said. Relief smoothing the lines at the corners of her eyes. Good. I was starting to think we were going to have to pour that coffee straight into you. Eliza struggled to push herself up on her elbows. Where? Greyhawk Ranch, the woman answered. She crossed the little room and set the mug on a small table, then reached to straighten the quilts. I'm Mara, Jonas's sister. Memory rushed back. In disjointed flashes: the storm, the square, the trunk, the moment her legs had given out, a man's face above her, voice saying her name as if he already knew it. The market, Eliza whispered. The bread. Mara smiled. Yes, the bread that made my brother stop in the middle of a crowd. No small feat, I might add. Eliza's throat felt tight. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cause trouble. I can pay for You'll pay by drinking that coffee before it goes cold. Mara interrupted gently. After that? We'll see. She helped Eliza sit up against the headboard, tucking pillows behind her. The quilts slid down enough for Eliza to see that someone had taken off her ruined shoes and wrapped her feet in dry wool socks. Her coat was nowhere to be seen. The snowstorm. Eliza said, slowly. I was outside the square. I don't remember. You collapsed. Mara said, her tone matter of fact, but not unkind. Jonas found you. You were half frozen and mumbling about train tickets. He wasn't about to let you stay there. As if summoned by his name, a shadow fell across the doorway. Jonas Greyhawk stood there, hat in his hands as if the small bedroom were a church and he wasn't quite sure where to put himself. Without the coat, he looked taller somehow, broader in the shoulders. His flannel shirt stretched across a chest that knew years of work. His gaze met Eliza's for a moment, and something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, surprise, maybe even a flicker of shared memory of bread and snow, and the way the crowd had shifted when he'd spoken. You're safe, he said quietly. You're at my place. About an hour out of town. You were in the snow too long? Embarrassment rushed up hot in Eliza's face. I'm sorry, she said quickly. I didn't mean to be any bother. If you'll just tell me how much I owe for the trouble, I'll. Jonas's brow creased, the faintest sign of irritation. You don't owe me for picking you up off the ground, he said. No one should have left you there in the first place. Mara cleared her throat softly. I'll see about those biscuits, she said, retreating toward the door. You two talk. Try not to scare her. Jonas, he gave her a patient look, but the corner of his mouth twitched. When the door clicked shut, the room grew very quiet. Eliza wrapped her hands around the coffee mug, grateful for something to hold. The warmth seeped into her fingers, easing the ache there. I appreciate your kindness, she said, forcing her voice to steady. I didn't expect anyone to stop. Jonas shifted his hat from one hand to the other, searching for words like a man unused to speeches. You were at my stall, she said, the memory rising. At the market. You bought a loaf. A hint of surprise warmed his eyes. You remember that? Yes. She looked down, a small smile flickering despite everything. You told me it tasted like home. It did, he replied simply. Still does. If I think about it. He leaned his shoulder lightly against the doorframe, the way a man did when he meant to stay long enough to finish what he had to say. I run a small cattle place out here, he began. Greyhawk Ranch. Got some decent pasture. A little creek that doesn't dry up, even in August. And a grist mill on the edge of the property that came with the land when I bought it. He paused, studying her face to see if she was following. The men who work for me, he went on, are good with horses and fences, less good with pots and pans. They treat coffee like it's food and jerky like it's a food group all by itself. A wry note crept into his voice. Mara does what she can, but there's only so much one woman can do. And she has her own work. Eliza listened, not quite sure where this was going. Hard picking up its pace. What I'm saying is, Jonas continued, a place like this could use someone who knows what to do with flour and an oven. Someone who can turn a hard day into something a man looks forward to at the end of it. He let that settle between them before he added, slower now. I can offer you a job, Miss Warren. Cooking and baking for the ranch and the hands. Wages. Every month you can hold in your own hand. A small cabin. Not a cot. In a hallway. You'd answer to yourself and to no landlady with sticky fingers. Eliza's breath caught. The words sounded too big, too generous. Like a coat, 2 sizes too large. She wasn't sure she was allowed to wear. I don't. She swallowed, the old habits rising up like walls. I don't take charity. Good. Jonas's answer came without hesitation. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a job. You'd earn every cent. And I'd sleep better knowing there's real food in my kitchen, instead of whatever the men think you can boil over a fire. Silence stretched out. The fire popped in the corner. Outside, she could hear the faint bawl of cattle, the wind rattling dry grass against the side of the cabin. Eliza stared down into her coffee, watching the surface tremble slightly in her hands. A job, wages, a cabin, not as someone's burden, not as someone's charity case, as a woman needed for what she could do with her own 2 hands. It was as terrifying as it was beautiful. Why me? She asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. You don't even know me. Jonas's answer was simple. I know what I tasted, he said. And I saw how you looked when that woman knocked your coins out of your hand in front of half the town. His jaw tightened slightly at the memory. A person who can still bake bread like that, with that kind of life, is not someone I mind having under my roof. Her eyes filled before she could stop them. She blinked fast, ashamed of the tears. I don't know if I remember how to be anything else, she admitted. Besides someone who's told where to stand and when to speak. Jonas shifted, straightened, and for the first time since he'd stepped into the room, his voice carried a quiet certainty that left no room for argument. Then this is as good a place as any to learn, he said. You can stay here until you decide what comes next. I won't send you back where you're not wanted. The tight fist that had been gripping her heart for years eased its hold. Just a fraction. Mara returned with a plate of biscuits and a small dish of honey, chattering about the weather and the stubbornness of one of the ranch horses, giving Eliza space to breathe. Later, when they left her alone to rest, Eliza swung her legs carefully over the side of the bed and stood. Her knees wobbled, but held. She shuffled to the window and pushed the curtain aside. The world beyond the glass was wide. Snow lay in gentle drifts across open pasture. Fences stitched the land into long, rolling lines. In the distance, low hills rose, tips dusted with white. A few dark dots cattle moved slowly against the pale ground. Smoke curled from a chimney she guessed belonged to the big house, somewhere beyond her sight. A creek muttered its winter song. It was nothing like the narrow street outside the boarding house. It was raw and rough and quiet, and it was hers to look at. She rested her palm against the cold glass, eyes tracing the horizon. Maybe, she whispered, words fogging the pain. This is where my life starts over. It didn't happen all at once. Eliza's new life at Greyhawk Ranch settled over her in layers, like quilts on a cold night, one small piece at a time, until she looked up and realized she was warm. Mornings came early out there, before the sun even thought about lifting its head over the far hills. Eliza was already in the kitchen, coaxing the stove to life. The world outside the window was a soft blue shadow, the kind that comes just before dawn. Inside, coffee bubbled in a blackened pot, filling the air with a smell that could pull a man out of the deepest sleep. She rolled biscuit dough while the house was still quiet, cutting neat circles, brushing the tops with a little milk when she had it. The first tray went in the oven, and she stood close, soaking up the heat, humming some half-remembered hymn under her breath. One by one, the men shuffled in, hair rumpled, boots half-laced, eyes still heavy. Tommy came first, more often than not. A lanky boy of 18, with ears a little too big for his head, and a grin that showed up before he did. "Mornin', Miss Eliza," he'd say, sniffing the air. "Smells like the angels decided to open a cafe down here. You just like anything that isn't beans," she'd reply, handing him a biscuit so hot he had to juggle it from hand to hand. Reeves came in next. Older, shoulders stooped from years in the saddle, beard gone mostly gray. He'd gruffly mutter something about too early for chatter, but he always took 2 biscuits and sat at the end of the table where the light hit his newspaper just right. At first, they ate like men who weren't sure how long the good food would last. Then, slowly, they began to relax into it. They learned that the coffee would be strong, but not bitter. The biscuits fluffy. The gravy rich enough to make them close their eyes for a second and sigh. They learned that if one of them came in late from checking on a sick calf, there'd still be a plate waiting on the back of the stove, covered with a clean towel. What Eliza learned was that feeding hungry men who said thank you instead of "you missed a spot" did something to a woman's heart. Those early days fell into a rhythm. The ranch woke with the sun. Men went out with the cattle, the creak of saddles and jingle of tack fading into the distance. Mara took care of the accounts and the endless, quiet work that kept the place from collapsing into chaos. Eliza washed dishes, set bread to rise, and planned the midday meal around whatever the pantry offered, and the garden still stubbornly gave up despite the cold. Somewhere in all of that, Jonas passed her kitchen door more times than necessity strictly required. He'd come in with the chill, still clinging to his coat, stomp his boots on the mat out of habit, and ask, "You eaten yet?" as if it were the most natural greeting in the world. The first time he did it, Eliza blinked. "Thrown. I will," she said, because that's what she always told herself. Later, after everyone else, Jonas frowned. Just a little. The next morning, there was an extra plate at the table when she turned around, set at the far end, near the stove. "Sit while it's hot," he said. "The kitchen's not going to fall apart in 10 minutes. She tried to argue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply waited, hand resting on the back of the chair, until her resistance felt more foolish than her fear. So Eliza sat. The world did not end. The dishes did not revolt. The roof did not cave in. Tommy told some ridiculous story about trying to ride a mule side saddle on a dare. Reeves rolled his eyes and muttered that youth was wasted on idiots. Mara laughed. Coffee steamed. Biscuits disappeared. And Eliza ate her breakfast. It was a small thing. It was everything. She began to experiment then. There were only so many ways to cook beans and potatoes. But in Eliza's hands, even the plainest ingredients found new shapes. She discovered that if she simmered the tougher cuts of beef low and slow with onions and a bay leaf, the meat softened, and the broth turned rich and deep. She learned that Jonas kept a secret stash of dried chilies in the pantry, and that a pinch of them in a pot of stew could warm a man straight through on a cold day. One afternoon, when the bread dough was particularly forgiving, she decided it was time. "Mr. Greyhawk," she called, wiping her floury hands on her apron as she stepped out onto the back porch. Jonas was out by the corral, checking a latch. He turned at the sound of her voice. "Eliza," he answered, tipping his hat. "Everything all right?" "That depends," she said, surprising herself with the hint of mischief in her own tone. "How badly do you want to learn how to make that bread you like so much?" A slow smile tugged at one corner of his mouth. Reckon I wouldn't mind knowing how to keep myself alive if the ranch cook up and runs off. I'm not planning on running off, she replied, then felt heat creep up her neck. But it never hurts to have another pair of hands in the kitchen. He followed her inside, ducking slightly through the doorway. The sight of Jonas Greyhawk standing uncertainly by her work table, hands too big and careful at his sides, did something soft to Eliza's insides. "All right," she said, setting a mound of dough in front of him. "First rule, don't be afraid of it. It's just bread." He protested. "It's never just anything," she said quietly, almost to herself. "Now, heels of your hands. Like this," she showed him, pressing down, folding, turning. Jonas watched, then mimicked her movements, the muscles in his forearms flexing under rolled-up sleeves. His first attempt was clumsy, too gentle, as if he were afraid the dough might fight back. "Put your weight into it," she told him. "You're trying to wake it up, not tuck it in." He huffed a laugh and tried again, this time a little too vigorously. The dough lurched, a puff of flour exploding off the table and into the air, drifting down in a soft white cloud. Some of it landed in his hair. A streak landed square on his cheek. Eliza clapped a hand over her mouth. A sound half gasp, half laugh, escaping. Despite herself, Jonas blinked through the flour, then grinned a rare, boyish expression that took years off his face. "Reckon I got the hang of it now," he said. She shook her head, laughing outright this time. A bright, unguarded sound she barely recognized as her own. In that moment, the kitchen wasn't a place of orders and criticism. It was just two people standing in a sunlit room, hands sticky with dough, flour on their clothes. Something easy and gentle moving between them. "If you keep feeding us like this," Jonas added, still working the dough under her watchful eye, "none of us will fit in the saddle by spring. That'll be your own fault," she replied, unable to stop smiling. "I'm only responsible for what comes out of the oven, not how many times you go back for seconds." Days blurred into weeks, each one laid down on top of the last, like pages in a book someone might want to read again someday. The ranch settled into winter. Cattle huddled closer to the windbreaks. The creek grew a rim of ice. Nights came early, sometimes, when her work was done, and the kitchen finally lay still, pots clean, bread set to cool, embers banked. Eliza would climb the narrow stairs to her small cabin and pause, hand on the latch, listening. More often than not, there was music. Jonas sat on the front porch of the big house on those nights, a blanket over his knees, a small wooden flute in his hands. The notes that drifted across the yard were low and wandering, not really a song, not anything Eliza recognized. They sounded like the way the land looked, wide and a little lonely, with a kind of rough peace under it all. One evening, the pull of that sound was too much. Instead of going inside, she followed the path up to the porch, boots crunching on the frost-hardened ground. Jonas looked up as she approached, the flute lowering from his lips. "Did I wake you?" he asked. "No," she said, stepping into the spill of lamplight. "I heard you playing." He shifted, nodding toward the empty rocker beside him. "Reeves says it sounds like a coyote in pain." "Reeves thinks coffee is soup," she said gently. "I wouldn't trust his opinion on music." Jonas huffed a quiet laugh and gestured again. She sat, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. For a while, they didn't speak. The stars burned cold and clear overhead, scattered across the sky like someone had flung a handful of sugar at the dark. Their breath rose in small white clouds. "When my mother was alive," Jonas said finally, turning the flute in his hands. "She used to play in the evenings." "Not this one." Another said it made the night less empty. "After she and my father were gone, I tried to remember her songs. Turns out, I remember the feeling more than the notes." Eliza listened, hands folded in her lap. "Did you grow up here?" she asked. "Not exactly. We moved where we had to." He glanced out toward the pasture. "Settled here when I was old enough to make something of my own without someone else owning it. This ranch is the first place that stayed. And your wife?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Mara mentioned. He didn't flinch. His gaze stayed on the horizon, where the land and sky met in a dark line. "She was from another band," he said. "We were married young. She liked this porch better than the house. Said she could breathe out here." A soft, fond smile touched his mouth and was gone. "Fever took her one spring. No children. Just the two of us and the work. I'm sorry," Eliza whispered. "It was a long time ago." He was quiet for a beat, then added, "Doesn't mean the space she left ever really closes. You just learn how to walk around it." He looked over at her then, head tilted. "What about you?" he asked. "You mentioned a train ticket that night, and I saw the way that woman Harrington talked to you in town. That wasn't the first time, was it?" Eliza swallowed, eyes dropping to her hands. "I was always the extra one," she said slowly. "After my mama died, my father remarried. There were cousins. Then, boarders. Then, I got passed around like something people put wherever it fit. Another pair of hands when they needed help. Another mouth when they didn't." She drew in a breath that trembled on the way out. "I learned early that the easiest way to be kept around was to be quiet and useful. Don't ask. Don't need. Don't expect. Just work." Jonas watched her, the lines around his eyes deepening. "And did it work?" he asked softly. "I suppose." She gave a small, humorless laugh. "I meant to stay alive. I did. But there was always the feeling that I could be put out with the trash at any time if I took up too much space." The porch boards creaked as she shifted, pulling the shawl closer. "I don't know what it's like to be kept," she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "Not the way people talk about being someone's first thought. Their home. I only know how to avoid being thrown away." The night held its breath. For a long moment, Jonas didn't answer. He looked out over the fields again, as if measuring his words against the quiet weight of the land. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, and sure. "Maybe what you needed," he said, turning back to her, "was never to be kept, just chosen." The wind stirred the dry grass. Somewhere out in the dark, a cow lowed sleepily. On the porch, under a sky wide enough to hold every broken thing and still be beautiful. Eliza Warren let those words settle into the places in her no one had ever spoken to before. For a little while, it almost felt like the past couldn't reach them anymore. Winter softened around the edges. The hard, biting cold gave way to days where the snow held its place, and the sun, when it showed its face, carried a hint of warmth with it. Life at Greyhawk Ranch settled into something steady and almost sweet. Long days, tired muscles, full plates, and small, quiet jokes traded over the supper table. Every few weeks, Jonas hitched the wagon and headed into town for supplies. On one of those trips, Mara insisted he take Eliza along. You'd think Clear Rock was another country, the way she avoids it," Mara said, hands on her hips. "Besides, if anyone knows how much flour we really go through, it's her," Eliza argued half-heartedly, then found herself sitting up beside Jonas on the wagon seat, gloves tucked into her lap, watching the road unspool beneath the horses' hooves. The air was crisp, her breath puffing white, but she felt oddly light. Free. They talked as they rode, not about heavy things, no ghosts of winters past. No confessions, just small, ordinary bits of life. Tommy's latest attempt to impress a girl at church, Reeves's ongoing feud with a particularly stubborn gait, the way the coffee always tasted different when Eliza brewed it over the fire instead of on the stove. Jonas said something dry about Reeves and the gate, and Eliza laughed, really laughed, head tilted back, the sound spilling out into the cold morning, like birds released from a cage. That was when Mrs. Harrington saw them. She was coming out of the dry goods store, a bolt of cloth over her arm, Pearl gliding along behind her. Her gaze snagged on the wagon rolling down the street, the Apache rancher up front, broad-shouldered and easy in the reins. The woman beside him with her hair neatly pinned, cheeks touched with color, eyes bright. Eliza, for a moment, something like shock flared in Mrs. Harrington's eyes, then her mouth flattened. "Well," she said, loud enough for the two women on the boardwalk beside her to hear. "I see she didn't waste any time, did she?" One of the church ladies blinked. "Who? That one?" Mrs. Harrington jutted her chin toward the wagon. "Ran off with that Apache. Living out there with him. No doubt. Heaven only knows what they're doing. My kindness repaid with sin and theft." Pearl's lips curved in a little satisfied smile. "Probably stealing from him like she tried to steal from us," she added, just as loud. The other women frowned, discomfort and curiosity wrestling on their faces. It didn't take much to tip the scales. A word here, an arch of an eyebrow there. By the time Jonas and Eliza climbed down at the feed store, a little knot of whispers had already started to form and grow. Such a shame. Seemed quiet enough. Always the quiet ones. Took advantage of that poor woman's hospitality, and threaded through it all. Unspoken but present. He was the same old thing Jonas had lived with his whole life. The idea that a man like him, with skin like his, and a name that sounded like the wind over the hills, must be part of whatever was wrong. Shopkeepers who'd once nodded briskly at Jonas now hesitated just a fraction longer before meeting his eye. A few of the church women drew closer together as Eliza passed, their smiles tight, their greetings just a shade too sweet. Eliza felt it, like a chill under her coat. She kept her chin up, kept her hands busy with lists and sacks and quiet thanks. But some of the warmth that had been blooming in her chest cooled a little. She didn't know just how cold it would get. A week later, as dusk settled thick and blue over the ranch, Jonas was in the barn checking a mare close to foaling when Reeves came in. Face grim. "Jonas," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "You've got company at the house. The kind with a badge. And a sour-faced woman who looks like she swallowed a nail." Jonas didn't need more than that. He stepped out into the yard, heart tightening. Lanterns glowed from the house windows, throwing yellow squares onto the hard-packed earth. A wagon he didn't recognize sat near the gate. The team still hitched, on the porch. Sheriff Dugan stood stiffly, hat in his hands, beside him, wrapped in righteous indignation, and her best wool coat, was Mrs. Harrington. Pearl hovered at her shoulder like a shadow. Mara was at the door, arms crossed, expression cool. "What's this about?" Jonas asked. Voice even. The sheriff cleared his throat. "Jonas. Evening. We got a complaint in town. Thought it best to come check things out right away." Mrs. Harrington stepped forward, eyes glittering. "It's more than a complaint, Sheriff. It's theft. That woman you've taken in, Eliza Warren, stole from my boarding house. Months of rent, kitchen, money, boarders' payments. Took it all and ran straight out here to her friend." Jonas felt something hot flash through his chest at the way she said friend. He kept his voice carefully level. "That's a lie," he said. "She left with nothing but a bad coat and a trunk you pushed down the stairs." Mrs. Harrington sniffed. Of course he'd say that. They're in it together. The sheriff shifted. Uncomfortable. "Be that as it may, I got folks in town saying there's a sizable amount of coin missing from the Harrington place. And that Miss Warren talked about buying herself a ticket and a room with money that wasn't hers." Mara's eyes narrowed. "And you think she dragged your sheriff all the way out here just on gossip?" "Gossip?" Mrs. Harrington bristled. "I know she took money. And I know where it is. These types always hide things under mattresses and floorboards. You can smell guilt a mile off." Jonas took a step closer, towering over her. "Watch your words." Dugan lifted a placating hand. "Look, nobody's hanging anybody tonight. But I am the law in this county. If there's nothing to hide, then a look around won't hurt anything. If there is, better we find it here than have folks stirring up worse in town." The insult and the implication that suspicion attached itself to the ranch like dust settled on Jonas's shoulders with a familiar weight. He swallowed it down. "You're not tearing this place apart on her say-so alone," he said quietly. Mara laid a hand on his arm. "Let them look," she said under her breath. Truth doesn't mind light. In the end, that was what swayed him. They went to Eliza's cabin first. She was inside, folding linens, humming as she worked. The look on her face when the sheriff and Mrs. Harrington stepped through her door without knocking would stay with Jonas for a long time. The surprise, then the swift, instinctive fear. Like a small animal hearing a trap spring. "Eliza Warren," Mrs. Harrington announced, eager. "You've been busy, haven't you?" Eliza straightened, hands clutching the towel. I don't understand." Sheriff Dugan cleared his throat, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "We've had an accusation made," he said. "We need to take a quick look around. For everyone's sake." "For whose sake?" Mara muttered. But Jonas hushed her with a glance. Mrs. Harrington moved around the little cabin like she owned it, yanking open drawers, lifting the lid of the trunk Reeves had repaired for Eliza when she first arrived. "Always hiding something," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Women like this never come by things honest." Eliza's face went pale. "I have nothing that isn't mine," she said, voice shaking but clear. "The clothes Jonas and Mara gave me. I buy what little else I need with the wages I earn. I haven't seen a single coin from your house since the day you knocked them out of my hand." Mrs. Harrington smiled then. A small, the vicious curve of the mouth. "We'll see." She swept to the narrow bed, grabbed the mattress with both hands, and heaved it up. For a second, there was nothing but the slats and a few dust motes spinning in the lamplight. Then everyone saw it, a small cloth pouch, tied with twine, tucked neatly between two boards. It might have been there for days. It might have been there for an hour. Mrs. Harrington swooped down on it like a hawk, holding it up triumphantly. Coins clinked inside. There, she crowed. Exactly where I said it would be. Eliza stared, eyes wide, color draining from her face. I've never seen that before in my life, she whispered. I swear to you, I don't know how. Lies? Mrs. Harrington snapped. You brought my money out here and hid it under your bed like some cheap thief. And you expect us to believe you didn't? Sheriff Dugan took the pouch reluctantly, weighing it in his hand. The coins inside made a dull, accusing sound. Eliza, he said, and there was pity in his voice now, which somehow hurt worse. I've known Mrs. Harrington a long time. She's got ledgers showin' money missing. And now there's this, found right where she said it would be, because she put it there. Mara burst out. Or that peacock of a daughter did. You think it's coincidence they show up just when the rumors in town weren't enough? Watch yourself, Miss Greyhawk, the sheriff warned. But his tone was weary more than sharp. Eliza shook her head, tears spilling over now. I didn't take anything, she said. You know me, Jonas. You've seen me. I know, Jonas said, his voice like gravel. I know. He stepped forward, putting himself between Eliza and the others, his presence filling the small room. Mrs. Harrington drew back slightly, but recovered. You're not going to charm your way out of this, she said. Not this time. I want her brought in. Let her stand up in front of people who actually matter and explain herself. Sheriff Dugan looked sick. Jonas, he said quietly, you know how this looks. I don't have much choice. There's enough here to justify a hearing. She'll have a chance to speak. But I've got to take her in tonight. The room seemed to narrow, the walls pressing in. Jonas's shoulders tensed. The other ranch hands had gathered in the doorway, faces dark with anger. It wouldn't take much a harsh word, a wrong move for this to tip from insult into something dangerous. He took a breath that felt like it scraped his ribs on the way in. If you take her, he said, every word slow and sharp-edged. You look me in the eye and swear you're taking an innocent woman, not just the easiest one to blame. Can you do that? Sheriff Dugan's jaw worked. He couldn't. They all knew it. I can swear she'll get her say, he managed. And that I'll do my best to see the truth heard. That's what I can swear. Jonas held his gaze a moment longer, then stepped aside. Eliza swayed, as if some part of her had been hoping he'd refuse and make the whole thing stop. Then she straightened, wiping at her face with the heel of her hand. I'll go, she said, voice small but unbroken. I won't have men hurt on my account. But I am not what she says I am. Mrs. Harrington snorted. We'll let the town decide that. They led Eliza out into the yard, the lantern light casting long shadows. The sheriff helped her up into the wagon as gently as he could under Mrs. Harrington's hawk-eyed supervision. As the horses started forward, Eliza clutched the edge of the seat and looked back. Jonas stood in the yard, fists clenched at his sides, eyes burning. Behind him, Mara and the hands watched, anger and helplessness etched into every line of their faces. Snow had started to fall again, soft flakes catching in Eliza's hair. She didn't cry this time. Her eyes were dry and bright, full of something that was part terror and part fury. Is this who I am to them? Then she thought as the ranch fell away behind her. A thief. A problem. something to drag off in the night. But beneath that, quieter and harder, another voice answered, "You know who you are." And so does he. The wagon rolled toward town, the darkness closing in like a held breath. Jail in Clear Rock was not much more than 3 cells and a potbelly stove that never quite chased the chill from the stone floor. They put Eliza in the far cell. The sheriff did what he could, brought an extra blanket, made sure she had water, but the bars between them might as well have been the years of her life, each one forged from a memory of being told she was less. She was lucky. She should be grateful. When the footsteps faded and the office door shut, the silence pressed in. She sat on the narrow bunk, blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching her breath fog in the dim light. The night crept through the cracks around the window like a living thing. It wasn't the first time she'd been shut away. Not like this, not with iron and a lock, but in other ways. Attics and back rooms. Kitchens no one else wanted. Corners where people put what they didn't know what else to do with. Always just out of sight. Always just out of reach of anything that looked like love. She stared at her own hands. The same hands that had kneaded dough that tasted like home to a man who had every reason to be careful with his trust. Does he regret it now? She wondered. Shame curling in her gut. Does he wish he'd ridden on by that night in the snow? She thought of Jonas's face in the cabin. Steady, as he'd said. I know what I tasted. Of his hands awkward in the dough. Flour on his cheek. Of the way his voice had sounded on the porch when he told her maybe she was meant to be chosen. Not kept. Tears burned behind her eyes. But she blinked them back. Whether he regretted it or not. Whether the town believed her or not. She knew what she had done and what she hadn't. For the first time in her life. That certainty felt like something solid she could wrap both hands around. Out at Greyhawk Ranch. Sleep didn't come easy for anyone. Mara sat at the kitchen table with a lantern between her and Jonas, its light throwing long shadows on the ceiling. Papers lay spread out, crumpled receipts, scribbled notes, Reeves paced, hat in his hands. Tommy perched on the edge of a chair. Restless. Sheriff's a decent man. Reeves said, he won't hang her on one woman's spite. No. Jonas answered. But decency bends under pressure. And Mrs. Harrington's been leaning on this town for a long time. Mara rubbed her forehead. We need more than our word, she said. We need theirs. She jerked her chin toward the hands. Tommy spoke up. I saw Miss Pearl in the yard earlier, he said. Before they showed up. Thought it was strange. She don't usually leave town unless there's a sale on ribbons. Reeves stopped pacing. You sure? Tommy nodded. She was near Eliza's cabin. Looked nervous as a cat in a dog yard when she saw me. I figured she'd come to cause trouble. But I didn't think he broke off. Guilt twisting his face. Could you swear to it? Jonas asked. In front of the sheriff. The town. Tommy swallowed. Then squared his shoulders. Yes. Sir. I can. Mara's eyes sharpened. What about that stable boy? She said. The one at Harrington's. Ben. He's always watching. That one. Knows who comes and goes. If Mrs. Harrington planned this, he might have seen something. Jonas rolled his shoulders, as if settling a saddle on his own back. Then we start there, he said. Before the town hall fills up with people who've already decided who's guilty. Morning came gray and thin. By the time the church bell rang 9, Clear Rock's town hall was full to bursting. People who had business there, and people who didn't crowded the benches and leaned against the walls. Their voices a low, buzzing hum. The preacher sat near the front, hands folded over his Bible. Store owners filled a row, whispering back and forth. Women who had once stood at Eliza's stall for bread now held their purses close, as if goodness could leak out if they loosened their grip. Words like Apache trash and fallen woman slipped through the room like snakes. Quick and mean, Eliza stood near the front, hands bound loosely in front of her, chin high, despite the tremor in her knees. Sheriff Dugan was beside her, looking more tired than angry, as though he hated every step of the dance he'd been forced to lead. Mrs. Harrington took the floor first. She knew how to use a room. Her voice trembled in all the right places here with outrage, there with wounded dignity. She painted a picture of herself as a generous landlady, taking in a stray, who repaid her with deceit. She came to me with nothing, Mrs. Harrington said, dabbing the corner of her eye with a lace handkerchief. I fed her, housed her, treated her like family, and all the while she was sneaking coins from my rent box, one little piece at a time, until I was left with holes in my accounts and a house on the edge of ruin. Pearl, sitting primly in the front row, sniffed, and then, Mrs. Harrington continued, voice gaining strength. She runs off in the night to the ranch of a man who doesn't even belong to this town, hides my money under her bed, carries on like a woman with no shame at all. The murmurs in the room swelled. Eliza closed her eyes for half a heartbeat, then opened them again. She would not let this woman write the story of her life. Sheriff Dugan cleared his throat. You've heard the accusation, he said. Now, if anyone has something different to say about these events, this is the time. There was a pause. Then Jonas Greyhawk stood. Conversations died mid-word. Heads turned. The knot of men at the back straightened. Some faces closed up, wary. Others watched with open curiosity. Jonas walked to the front of the room. Every step measured. At the edge of the platform, he took off his hat and held it in both hands, looking out over the town that had never quite decided whether he was neighbor or stranger. My name is Jonas Greyhawk, he said. Most of you know that. Some of you know my accounts better than you know me. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the merchants. I buy my lumber from Lawson, he went on, nodding toward a man on the left. My nails and tools from Denby. My coffee and beans from the general store. I pay what I owe. On time. In full. And if any man here says different, I invite him to stand up and say so. Silence. No one stood. Jonas let that settle, then turned his gaze toward Mrs. Harrington. As for Miss Warren, he said, his voice steady, I found her half frozen in your street 2 days before Christmas. No coat worth the name. No money in her pockets. No shoes fit to keep out the snow. A woman you say stole from you, and yet you put her out with nothing. Mrs. Harrington bristled. I don't have to explain how I run my house to, then let someone else explain what they saw. Jonas cut in. Sheriff, if it please you, I have a few folks who'd like a turn to speak. Dugan's eyes met his. For all his weariness, there was a spark of respect there. Go ahead, he said. Call him. Jonas gestured toward the back. Tommy stepped forward, fiddling with his hat, then straightened under Jonas's encouraging nod. I work for Mr. Greyhawk, he said. Name's Tommy Briggs. I saw Miss Pearl Harrington out at the ranch the afternoon before they came with the sheriff. She was skulking around Miss Eliza's cabin. When she saw me, she jumped like she'd been caught, with her hand in the sugar. Gasps and whispers erupted. Pearl's face went scarlet. That proves nothing. Mrs. Harrington snapped. My daughter could visit whoever she pleases. Then maybe Ben ought to talk about where you were visiting, Jonas said. A small, wiry boy rose hesitantly from a corner bench. He clutched his cap in both hands, eyes darting from Jonas to the sheriff, to Mrs. Harrington. It's all right, son, Dugan said gently. Just tell it how you saw it. Ben swallowed hard. I work at the Harrington stable, he said. Take care of the horses. Muck out the stalls. Couple days ago, I saw Mrs. Harrington in the yard, with a little sack of coins. She was mad, saying something about fixing that ungrateful girl good. Then she told Miss Pearl to get the wagon. Later that day, I seen her near Miss Eliza's old room, and she wasn't supposed to be up there. He twisted his cap, eyes filling. I didn't say nothin' then, 'cause, well, she's my boss. But when Mr. Greyhawk came askin', he glanced at Eliza, then back at the sheriff. It ain't right. Locking up the wrong person. Another murmur rolled through the hall. This one darker, angrier. A neighbor woman stood next a thin, sharp-faced lady who lived across from the boarding house. I heard her, too, she said, nodding toward Mrs. Harrington, bragging to one of her friends about how she took care of that useless woman and got her out from underfoot for good. Didn't think much of it then, I'm ashamed to say. But put together with this, she shook her head. It doesn't sit right. Dugan's jaw tightened. He turned to Eliza. Miss Warren, he said. You got anything to add? Eliza felt the weight of every eye in the room. She stepped forward. Her voice shook on the first word. But she did not let it break. I worked at Mrs. Harrington's house for years, she said. With no pay. Just a roof and scraps from other people's plates. I bought my own flour, my own sugar, my own cloth. Every coin I earned at that market went straight to her hand by force. I left with nothing. Everything I have now, I earned at Greyhawk Ranch. She met the preacher's gaze, then the shopkeepers, then the faces of women who had tasted her bread. I am not a thief, she said. Not of money, not of husbands, not of anything. Her words hung there, simple and true. Sheriff Dugan blew out a breath, long and slow. Whatever doubt he'd been trying to hold on to slid off his face. I've heard enough, he said. Mrs. Harrington, your story's got more holes than a colander. And now, we got witnesses saying you were moving money around behind folks' backs. I can't say exactly what happened to your coins, but I can say this. There's not near enough here to brand Miss Warren a criminal. He turned to Eliza and reached for the rope around her wrists. As far as the law's concerned, he said, tugging the knot loose. You're free. The word rang in her chest like a bell. Free. Mrs. Harrington sputtered, color rising in blotches up her neck. You can't just let her, after all I've. Dugan held up a hand. Far as I'm concerned. Ma'am, you've said enough. If anyone wants to bring charges about false accusations or planted evidence, we can talk about that. In the meantime, I suggest you sit down. The room was buzzing now. People turning to one another, their earlier certainty crumbling under the weight of what they'd heard. Some looked ashamed, some defensive. A few watched Eliza with new eyes, as if seeing past the faded dress to the spine beneath it. In the middle of that noise, Jonas stepped forward. He didn't climb onto the platform. He didn't raise his voice much. But somehow, the sound of him cut through the hum, like a clear note. "Eliza," he said. She turned toward him, wrists bare now, skin marked faintly by the rope. "You have nowhere you can go back to," he said, each word steady and sure. "But you have a place with me. You already run my kitchen. You already hold this ranch together in more ways than one. I want you to run my life too, if you'll have me." A hush fell. It wasn't a fairy tale, Neil. Jonas stood there tall and solid, hat in his hands. A man who knew what it meant to lose, and to build, and to choose anyway. His eyes were on her, not the crowd. Eliza's breath came fast. Her heart beat so hard she could feel it in her throat. "All my life," she said slowly, the truth spilling out before she could stop it. "I was something people used, and then pushed aside. A spare pair of hands, an extra mouth. If I say yes, will you ever throw me away?" Jonas's answer came without hesitation. "Not even if the whole town told me to," he said, something in her that had been braced for years for impact, for rejection, for the next blow finally, blessedly. "Let go." "Yes," she whispered. Then, stronger, "Yes." For a moment, no one moved. The town of Clear Rock, with all its gossip and grudges, just stared. Then, from the middle row where the older church women sat, a pair of hands began to clap. Another set joined. Then another. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't thunder. It was something better. It was the sound of people who had seen a woman stand up under the weight of falsehood and refuse to bend, and a man stand beside her in front of everyone, and decided belatedly, imperfectly, to honor it. They married the way they'd lived without spectacle, but with their whole hearts. Spring had come by the time Jonas and Eliza stood under the cottonwood tree near the ranch house. Its new leaves whispered overhead, casting dappled shade over the little gathering. There was no choir, no organ, no long march down an aisle. Just the preacher, from Clear Rock with his worn Bible, a handful of ranch hands in their cleanest shirts, Mara beaming like she'd planned the whole thing, and a few townspeople who had chosen, finally, to stand where the truth was. Eliza's dress was plain but well made, stitched by her own hands in the soft, late hours after supper. The fabric fell smooth over her, simple as the life she'd prayed for and never dared to expect. Jonas wore his best shirt, collar, a little too stiff for his liking, and around his neck hung a beaded necklace his mother had made a quiet blessing from a woman who'd left this world long ago. Their vows were not poetic. They didn't need to be. They promised to share work and warmth and whatever the seasons brought. They promised to speak straight, to stand side by side when the wind rose, to remember who they had been, so they could honor who they were becoming. As the preacher spoke, Jonas's thumb moved in small, steady circles over the back of Eliza's hand, grounding her. When she said, "I do," tears slipped down her cheeks, catching the sunlight and turning into tiny sparks, as if the day itself were applauding. When it was done, there was no grand announcement, no orchestra swell, just the sound of clapping hands. A whoop from Tommy, Reeves clearing his throat a little too loudly, and Mara laughing as she pulled Eliza into a fierce, happy hug. Life didn't magically turn easy after that, but it turned theirs. Months later, Greyhawk Ranch bore the marks of two steady hands. Fences stood firm. Cattle grew fat. The creek sang a happier song. And from the ranch house kitchen, on most days, The smell of Eliza's bread rolled down the road like an invitation. The people of Clear Rock noticed. Women who had once crossed the street to avoid her now rode out in buggies, coins in hand, asking for loaves and pies like the ones you brought to the church social. Men who had whispered about that Apache out on the edge of town followed the scent of cinnamon and came back with respect in their eyes. On Sundays, children begged to come along for her cinnamon rolls, sticky and warm, their laughter tumbling across the yard as they chased one another around the water trough. Mrs. Harrington was gone. After the hearing, her standing in town had crumbled faster than old plaster. Boarders left. Friends stopped calling. Before summer fully settled in, she and Pearl had loaded up their things and moved on to some other place that didn't yet know their brand of charity. Eliza and Mara ran the kitchen like a joyful command center. They barked orders at cowboys and shooed Jonas out when he tried to sneak a roll before dinner. There was flour on the floor and laughter in the air, and a sense, everywhere you looked, of a home that was being actively potted, lovingly built, and then, almost before anyone realized it, winter came around again. On one of those early cold evenings, the kind where the sky turns purple before supper's even cleared, the ranch house windows glowed warm against the dark. Smoke curled from the chimney in a steady line. Inside, bread cooled on the table, and stew rested heavy in the pot. Jonas came in from the yard, dust and a fine sprinkling of snow on his coat, the cold still clinging to his hair and beard. Eliza wiped her floury hands on her apron without thinking and walked straight into his arms, fitting against him like she'd been carved for that place. They stood together in the doorway for a moment, shoulder to shoulder, watching the smoke from their own chimney rise into the cold sky. In a town that once decided she was nobody, Eliza Warren's name became the one people spoke when they smelled fresh bread on a winter wind. And if anyone asked how she found her home so late in life, she would just smile, reach for the Apache rancher at her side, and say, "I wasn't found. I was finally chosen." My friends, if this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments what part stayed with you the most, and let me know where you're listening from. What town? What state? What little corner of the world you call home? If these Apache stories keep you company in the quiet hours, don't forget to like this video. Share it with someone who needs a little hope tonight. And subscribe so you don't miss the next tale by the fire. Until then, may you always know that it's never too late to be chosen.